Wait, you're telling me someone just left you land? Not just land, 900 acres? And I think I just inherited a problem with it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a water bill and a coupon magazine, like it was nothing special. My name was typed across the front in the kind of formal font that means someone, somewhere, is very serious about something. I set my coffee down and read it twice. My great-uncle Arthur had died at 87, alone on his land in rural Texas. The way he had always said he wanted to go quietly, without fuss, with his boots somewhere nearby. I had met him exactly 4 times in my life, but apparently that had been enough. He left me everything. 912 acres of rolling Texas land, a farmhouse built in 1941, 2 barns, a creek that ran cold even in August, and a timber lease that had been paying out quietly for 11 years. I was 34 years old, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Denver, Colorado, working a remote project management job that I liked well enough, but never loved. I had no wife, no kids, no particular reason to stay. I gave my notice, packed a truck, and drove south. The farmhouse needed work, but it had good bones. The floors were wide plank oak. The ceilings were high. The porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house and looked out over a meadow that turned gold in the late afternoon. Arthur had kept the place clean and functional, if not exactly modern. I spent the first 2 weeks just walking the land, learning its edges, finding the places where the creek bent and the deer trails crossed, and the old fence lines told stories about how the land had been used 100 years ago. I was not thinking about homeowners associations. It did not occur to me, not even once, that an HOA had anything to do with 900 acres of rural Texas farmland. That was my first mistake, not checking. The subdivision had been carved out a corner of the county about 20 years earlier. 43 homes, a paved road, a small pond with a fountain in it, and a set of CC and Rs that had been drafted by a lawyer who clearly enjoyed his work. The subdivision sat on land that had once been part of the original parcel. Arthur had sold off that corner in the early 2000s to settle some debts. And when a developer built it out, they had attached a covenant that tied the surrounding acreage to the HOA's jurisdiction for purposes of aesthetic, continuity, and community standards. Arthur had signed it. I don't know if he read it, knowing Arthur, probably not. I found out about it when Brenda Sterling knocked on my door. Brenda was the HOA board president. She was somewhere in her early 60s, dressed in pressed khakis and a collared shirt, and she carried a clipboard with the calm authority of a woman who had been carrying clipboards her entire adult life. She introduced herself pleasantly enough and then handed me a packet. 12 violations. My tractor was parked in a visible area and needed to be stored inside a structure. The barn paint was a non-approved color. It was red. The original red had been painted before I was born. The split-rail fence along the east meadow had 2 broken rails. My truck, which I had parked near the barn because I had been hauling lumber, was considered a commercial vehicle and could not be stored on the property without a variance. There were more, but those were the ones she highlighted. I flipped through the packet. I asked her very politely, where in the governing documents it said these rules applied to my land. She pointed to a clause on page 14 of the CC and Rs surrounding parcels, aesthetic continuity. I read it standing in my own doorway and felt something cold settle in my chest. I thanked her, told her I would look into it, and closed the door. I spent that evening at the kitchen table with the deed, the CC and Rs, the original sales agreement from 2003, and a yellow legal pad. By midnight, I had 4 pages of notes and a very uncomfortable feeling that Brenda Sterling might technically be right. The clause was broad, sloppily written, but it had Arthur's signature, and it had been recorded with the county. I called a real estate attorney in Austin the next morning. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and she had a voice that made you feel like problems were just puzzles waiting to be solved. I sent her the documents. She called me back that afternoon. The clause is real, she said, but it's also a mess. The enforceability depends on how far they want to push it, and honestly, if they try to enforce it aggressively, they might not like what we find on the other side, she explained. The HOA's original development had relied on an easement across the corner of Arthur's land for their stormwater drainage. That easement had been granted informally, never properly recorded, and technically required the goodwill of whoever owned the surrounding parcel. That was now me. I asked her what that meant practically. She paused. It means you have leverage. The second letter from the HOA arrived 3 weeks later. The tone had shifted. Brenda had apparently consulted her own attorney, and the violations had become formal citations with fine schedules attached. $40 per day for the tractor, $25 per day for the barn color. The total, if left unaddressed, would compound quickly. I drove over to the HOA office, which was a small room attached to the community clubhouse. Brenda was there with 2 other board members, a man named Gary, who kept clicking his pen, and a woman named Nancy, who looked like she would rather have been anywhere else on earth. I sat down. I laid Evelyn Reed's letter on the table. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. It outlined the unrecorded drainage easement. It noted that under Texas law, an unrecorded easement was not automatically enforceable against a new owner who had purchased without notice. It stated that my client, me, was reviewing his options with respect to that easement, and that any aggressive enforcement action regarding the CC and our aesthetic clause would be considered in that context. Gary stopped clicking his pen. Brenda read it twice. I watched her face. She was smart enough to understand what she was reading, and I respected her for that. We reached an agreement 2 weeks later, sitting around the same table with both attorneys on a conference call. The HOA would drop all pending fines and violations. In exchange, I would store the tractor inside the barn when not in active use, and I would repair the 2 broken fence rails. The barn color would remain red. It had been red for 80 years, and it would stay red. The truck could park where I needed it to park. I would also grant a properly recorded, limited easement for stormwater drainage valid for 30 years, at the end of which both parties could renegotiate. Everyone signed. Everyone shook hands. Nancy looked genuinely relieved. That was 2 years ago. I still live on the land. The barn is still red. The tractor sits in the barn when I'm not using it, which is a reasonable ask, and I understand that now. Brenda waves when she drives past on the county road, and I wave back. We are not friends, but we are neighbors, and out here, that means something. Arthur left me more than acreage. He left me a position and a hard lesson. That knowing what you own and what it's worth, and exactly where your rights begin and end, is the only real foundation you ever have. I learned to read the documents first. Won't make that mistake again.